The gas lamp at the Walworth station burned pale against the wet January glass. A man had come in from the street, his coat dark with rain, his hands folded in front of him as if in prayer. He gave his name softly. William Sheward. He said he had killed his wife. It had happened in Norwich, a long time ago. The sergeant looked up from the ledger. His pen stopped. Outside, a cab passed and the horses' hooves echoed once and were gone. 18 winters had passed since Norwich. Since that basket, and the river, and the quiet road at dusk. He had carried it all, alone, across the length of those years. And now, in a room lit by a single lamp, he was setting it down. The clock on the wall struck the hour. Rain began again on the glass. The confession at Walworth. Good evening, and welcome. This is the Bedside Historian. The night has settled around you now, and the world outside has grown small and slow. Perhaps the rain is at your window, or perhaps the room is warm and still. Wherever you are, and whatever hour has found you, I am glad you are here with me. Tell me, if you can, where you are listening from tonight. A city, a village, a long road at the end of a long day. And what time it is on your side of the night. It is a little thing to know, and yet it makes this feel less like a broadcast and more like a room shared by two people in the dark. If you find that these stories keep you company, I hope you will subscribe to the channel and press the little icon that helps the quiet numbers behind it. It asks nothing of you, and it helps this small candle keep burning in the forgotten corners of the world. Now let us go back through the wet January of 1869, into a London parish that no longer looks the way it did that night, into a police station in Walworth where a man was standing at the counter with rain running from the hem of his coat. Walworth in that winter was a rough sprawl south of the river, part market gardens gone to brick, part crowded rows of terraces built for clerks and porters, and the men who kept the omnibuses running. The gas was on in the shop windows down the New Kent Road. The pavements were slick with a fine, unhurried rain that had been falling since the last light of the afternoon. There were second-hand clothes hung in the doorways of the pawnbrokers, and steam on the glass of the coffee houses, and boys running with newspapers under their arms. The station itself sat back a little from the street, a low building with a single blue lamp above the door, and the smell of coal smoke and wet wool hanging over the step. A little before 9 o'clock, the door opened, and William Sheward came in from the wet. He was a small man in his middle 50s, thin at the shoulders, with grey hair combed flat, and the kind of quiet, tidy face that a stranger would forget within an hour of seeing it. His coat was thin and dark, and had known better winters. His boots were worn through at the toe. He carried no bag. He carried no umbrella. He stood inside the door for a long moment while the water pooled around his feet, and then he walked to the counter and took off his hat. The sergeant on duty that night was a man named Davis. He was writing in the station ledger by the light of a single burner turned low. He was used to men coming in from the street with the smell of gin about them, or with a bloodied lip, or with a boy in tow who had lifted a loaf from a barrow. He looked up and he waited. William Sheward said, very quietly, that he wished to give himself up. The sergeant put down the pen. He asked what for, and William Sheward said that he had killed his wife, and that it had happened in Norwich, and that it had happened a very long time ago. There is a silence in the record here, and I think about it often. Sergeant Davis said nothing for a moment. He asked the man to repeat what he had said. The man repeated it. The rain went on against the window. Somewhere further down the corridor, a door was pulled shut. The little clock above the counter ticked on, indifferent, and the gas hissed in its mantle. We have to sit with what that room was, for a heartbeat, before the machinery of the law took over. A tired officer at the end of a long shift. A stranger dripping on the boards. A confession delivered so softly that the sergeant had to lean forward to catch it. No shouting. No struggle. Only the small, dry voice of a man who had carried a thing across a great many winters and had decided, at last, to set it down on this counter on this evening in this parish. We do not know why he came to Walworth that night of all places. We do not know why he chose the 1st of January, 1869, when he could have chosen any of the 6,000 nights that had come before it. 2 accounts written years later gave different reasons, and neither is easy to trust. He may have been drunk, though the officers there swore afterwards that he was not. He may have caught sight, that morning, of his second wife on the arm of another man in a London street, and felt his own hidden self lift its head. He may have come to the end of himself in some small way that no one at the counter could see. The record does not say. It only says that he came in from the rain and asked to be believed. The sergeant, in the end, believed him enough to send for the inspector. While they waited, William Sheward sat on the wooden bench along the wall, his hat between his knees, his hands folded in his lap. He did not fidget. He did not weep. He asked, once, for a glass of water, and it was brought to him, and he drank it in small sips, and set the tumbler down. A constable coming in off his beat looked at the man on the bench and thought nothing of him. Later, when the constable read the morning papers, he said that he could not for the life of him remember the face. The inspector on duty was a man of some years, careful, patient, not given to hurry. When he came into the room, William Sheward stood up and gave his name again, and again said that he had killed his wife in Norwich, and again gave the year, 1851, and again gave the name of the woman he had killed. Martha Francis, that had been her name before their marriage. He said it as a man says the name of a place he has been walking away from for half his life. The inspector took him into an inner room and closed the door and asked him to begin at the beginning. Let me stop here for a moment, in the passageway, before that door, because what is about to happen in that room is a strange thing, and it is worth being ready for it. A confession, in law, is a legal instrument. It has to be written down. It has to be read back. It has to be signed. It has to be witnessed. The man in the coat had walked in off the street with a story 18 years old, and now, by his own choice, he had to build it, sentence by sentence, in front of officers he had never met, and watch them write it into a book that would follow him into court. That, on any night, would be a long and difficult labour. On a rainy Friday, after the last of the Christmas gas had come down from the windows on the New Kent Road, it must have felt like a small eternity. He gave his statement slowly. He said that he had lived in Norwich as a young man, and that he had married a woman older than himself, and that they had not been happy. He said that the marriage had broken under quarrels and money, and that on a Sunday morning in June of 1851, in a small house he named for them, he had cut her throat with a razor. He said what he had done with the body afterwards. He said where he had carried the parcels, and where he had set them down, and what road he had taken back to the empty room. The inspector wrote as he spoke. Now and then the pen stopped, and a question was put, and William Sheward answered it and waited for the pen to catch up. His voice, they said afterwards, did not shake. It did not rise. He did not weep, even when he came to the razor. He did weep later, in the corridor, when he was asked whether he wished to send word to anyone. The record does not say who he thought of first. Only that he covered his face with a handkerchief for a small while, and then took it away, and asked for another cup of water, and drank it. You may find, as I have, that this is the hardest part of the whole story to hold in the mind. The killing itself, when we come to it, is the sort of thing the Victorian papers wrote about at length, and they told it with a certain relish. But the confession is quieter than that. It is a middle-aged man in a wet coat in a small parish station, giving a story back to the world in the exact order in which he had first lived it, and asking, in the plainest words, to be taken away. By the small hours he had signed the statement. The clock above the desk had gone round past midnight, and the New Kent Road outside had grown quiet, and the omnibuses had stopped, and the only sound in the street was the water in the gutters and the occasional call of a night constable further off. William Sheward was placed in a cell at the back of the station. He was given a blanket. He asked, very politely, whether the light in the passage might be left burning, because he did not care for the dark. The turnkey said that it would be. The cell door closed. The bolt slid home. There is a small line in one of the papers of the following week that I have never been able to get out of my head. A reporter who spoke to one of the officers wrote that when they looked in on the prisoner an hour later, he was asleep. Not restless. Not weeping. Asleep, with his boots off and his hands folded on his chest, like a man who had at last lain down after a very long walk. I do not know whether the reporter made it up, or whether the officer told it to him straight, or whether it fell somewhere between the two, as most things in the newspapers of that decade did. But I think of it often. 18 winters he had carried the thing. On the first night after he set it down, he slept. We must leave him there for a little while, in his cell in Walworth, with the blanket around him and the gas turned low in the passage, and we must go north with the telegraph. Because a confession in a London parish station was not, on its own, enough. Norwich had to be told. The officers of the Norfolk Constabulary had to be woken. Old files had to be pulled out of dark cupboards, and old inquest papers unrolled, and old witnesses, if any could be found, sent for. There were policemen still living in Norwich who had walked the lanes that summer of 1851, hunting for the owner of a set of bones that had turned up in ditches and by the river, and who had never, for all their walking, found him. Now, in a wet January 18 years later, a wire came clattering into the office at Norwich to say that the man had walked in of his own accord, off a London street, and confessed. The Norwich officers, when they read it, are said to have been quiet for a long time. One of them, who had been a young constable in 51, said only that he remembered the case, and that he had never expected to hear of it again. Another asked whether the man in the London cell was in his right mind. The wire came back, calm and short, that he appeared to be entirely so. Arrangements were made. A superintendent from Norwich would come down by train to fetch him. A magistrate in Lambeth would sign the papers. A journey would be booked, in the ordinary way, for a prisoner in irons, in a second-class carriage on the Great Eastern Line, back to the city he had left almost 2 decades before. There is a strange stillness to those hours. The confession has been made, and the machinery has begun to turn, and it will not stop turning now until it has carried William Sheward through a courtroom and up a set of wooden stairs. But nothing of that is visible yet. In Walworth cell, a man is sleeping. In Norwich, the gas has been lit in a superintendent's office, and a kettle has been set on for tea, and someone is reading a wire twice through to make sure of it. Outside both windows, in both cities, the same January rain is falling. Before we leave this room, take a moment with me. Somewhere in your own life, you will know the weight of a thing not spoken. Perhaps not a thing like this. Perhaps only a small, private wrongness carried across a decade, or a word not said to a person now gone, or a debt of the heart that has never been settled. Feel for a heartbeat what it might be to set that thing down on a wooden counter under a gas lamp, in a strange parish, in the middle of a wet January night, and to walk without it into the next room. Then imagine that you had carried it, not for a year, but for 18, and that when you set it down, it did not vanish. It grew a shape. It began, at once, to walk beside you. That is what had come, at last, into the little station at Walworth. Not a monster, not a madman, a tailor's cutter from a Norwich workhouse alley, a failed pawnbroker, a small tidy man who had once been young in a market city in the mist, and who had followed one wrong Sunday down a long chain of quiet, hidden years. To understand how he came to that counter, we have to go back further than 1851. We have to go back before the razor, and before the basket, and before the older woman with the sharp tongue and the small inheritance. We have to go back to a boy in a workhouse in Norwich, listening to the bells above the cathedral at dawn, and to the shears of the tailors in the rooms above the yards, and beginning to learn the trade that would give him, for a little while, an honest life. The rain went on against the Walworth glass. The turnkey walked once more down the passage and looked in through the grille. William Sheward did not stir. In Norwich, a lamp burned late in an office by the market square, and a superintendent folded a wire in half and put it in his pocket, and reached for his coat. A Norwich Apprentice. We must leave the Walworth cell now, and the sergeant with his ledger, and the wire clattering north through the wet dark, and we must go back much further than a January night in 1869. We must go back 40 years and more, into a Norwich that most people alive today would not know if they stood in the middle of it, and we must find a boy of 11 or 12 making his way each morning up the wet cobbles toward the room where the shears were kept. The Norwich of his boyhood was a city of wool. It had been a city of wool for 400 years before he was born, and it had another lifetime or two of the trade still in it, though the wiser men in the coffee houses already knew that the tide was going out. The great mills of the north, in Bradford and Halifax and Leeds, had begun to eat the trade one contract at a time. But the looms of Norwich were still going in the 1820s. Behind the pargetted fronts of the houses on Magdalen Street and Coalgate, and up the narrow stair of 100 garrets across the city, the clack of the wooden treadle could be heard from before first light until well after the church bells rang for evensong. He was born in a low, damp lodging in the alleys under the cathedral, in the spring of 1812. His people were poor. His father worked with his hands, when the work was there, and drank when it was not. There were mouths at the table, and there was seldom bread enough on it, and the boy learned early the small arithmetic of hunger, one loaf between how many, on how many days, until the next coin came in from wherever it might come. The parish registers spelled the family name 2 or 3 ways, and no one now can say which of them the father would have written for himself, because the father, like most of that street, could not write his name at all. The cathedral bell at dawn was the clock of that boyhood. It rang across a warren of alleys and yards that no map you could hold in your hand today would help you find, because most of them were cleared away in the century that followed. Tanner's Yard, Boggart Row, the old rope walk behind St. Miles. The gutters ran down the middle of the lanes with the leavings of 100 small trades, dyers' vats, brewers' mash, the offal of the fish stalls in the market. In the wet months, and Norwich has more wet months than dry ones, the mud in those alleys came up over the tops of a child's shoes and did not dry until April. When the wind came off the fens from the northeast, the smell of the herring smokehouses at Yarmouth carried inland with it. When it came from the south, it brought the smell of the sheep pens at the market. It was never a place that smelled of nothing. I would like you to hold that city in your mind for a heartbeat, because it is not the Norwich you might find today. It was a place still built to the shape of the Middle Ages, with a great flint cathedral at one end and a great stone castle at the other, and between them a thick tangle of parishes so old that no one remembered whose saint had blessed the ground first. It was noisy. It was crowded. It smelled of animals. And it had, running through the heart of it, a slow brown river called the Wensum, which we shall come to know very well before this story is over. Somewhere in the middle of that boyhood, the boy was set to a trade. The record is not exact on the year. It is likely that he was 11 or 12 when he first crossed the threshold of a tailoring shop as an apprentice, because that was the age at which parish boys were bound in those years. It is likely, too, that the parish had a hand in the placing of him, because his people would not have had the fee to set him to a master on their own account. The paper was signed in any case. He was bound for 7 years to learn the craft of the tailor, and to serve his master honestly, and to keep no company that would bring the trade into disrepute. He put a rough cross where his signature was to go. The master signed for him, and on a morning in the autumn of, so far as anyone can tell, 1823, William Sheward walked in through a door on London Street for the first time as a bound boy. The shop was up a flight of scrubbed wooden stairs above a chandler. It smelled of chalk and wool and hot iron, and the beeswax that the men rubbed into their thread. There were 3 men at work on the board when he came in, a broad table set at the height of the waist, with the daylight falling on it from a window at the north side, because a tailor needs a north light to see the cloth true. The men sat cross-legged on the board itself, in the fashion of the trade, with their feet drawn up under them. They had been sitting like that since they were boys, and their knees, by the middle of a working life, were shaped for it. He was set at first to the lowest work: to carry the coals up the stair for the flat irons, to sweep the clippings from under the board, to fetch water from the pump in the yard, and to keep the fire going in the grate at the back of the room, where the great irons stood heating on their rest. Tailors' irons in those years were solid pieces of cast iron, 12 pounds or more, and a full-grown man would swap between two of them all day so that one could reheat while the other worked the seam. To lift them from the fire, the men used a folded rag or a leather grip, and if a boy on his first month at the trade let one slip on the boards, he was cuffed for it, and he did not let one slip again. He learned, in that first year, the language of the room. Cabbage was the leavings of cloth that a cutter kept from every job for himself, an old rite of the trade, as old as the trade itself, and it was worth a shilling or two at the second-hand stall on a Saturday. The board was the table. The goose was the pressing iron, so named for the long curve of its handle. Bombazine was the black stuff, half silk and half worsted, that Norwich had made its name on, and that widows and mourners across 3 kingdoms wore for the year and a day of their grief. The crepe was the crimped mourning cloth that went on the hat and the sleeve. A weft was a thread that ran across the loom. A warp was a thread that ran along it. And a cutter, the highest hand in the shop, was the man who took a length of new-woven cloth and, with a stick of tailor's chalk and a great pair of shears, laid out on it the shapes of a coat. Take a moment with me here, before we go on, because the making of a coat by hand is a thing few of us alive have ever watched. A gentleman's frock coat in the 1820s began as a bolt of worsted from one of the Norwich looms, wound tight on a wooden roller, and delivered up the stair on a man's shoulder. The cutter unrolled it across the board and let it settle. He walked the length of it and read it as a shepherd reads a hillside, the run of the nap, the flaws in the weave, the way the light took the surface at different angles. Then he chalked it. Then he cut it. A skilled cutter could lay the pieces of a coat on a length of cloth in his head before ever a shear touched the wool, and the leavings, when he was done, would be a handful of scraps no larger than his palm. A poor cutter left cabbage the size of a shirt on the floor, and his master noticed, and his master remembered. The boy watched. That was the work of his first years, more than any lifting or sweeping. He watched the men on the board. He watched the shears go into the cloth. He watched a sleeve come off the bolt in one long shape, and a lapel in another, and a back panel folded and cut in halves so that the 2 sides matched. He watched, and slowly, in the way of a trade that has been passed by watching for 1,000 years, the shapes of the coat began to live in his hand before they lived on the cloth. By the end of his 4th or 5th year at the board, he was trusted with a pair of shears of his own. He would not have been given the cutting of a fine coat, not yet, because that was a work of nerve as much as skill, and the loss of a length of good worsted could beggar a shop in an afternoon. But he was given the lining. He was given the pockets. He was given the linen bags that went inside the coat tails, and the tape for the buttonholes, and the working of the patient stitches along a hem. He kept his own beeswax. He kept his own thread. He was called, when the master had a moment to be kind, a promising hand. There is not much in the record of who the boy was in those years, in his own person. The apprentice paper survives. The record of his baptism survives. A note or two from the workhouse, and a mention in a rate book. The rest is inference, and I will be honest with you where the inference lies. What we can say is that he grew into a tidy young man, not tall, not strong in the shoulders, careful with his hands. He liked, on a Sunday, to walk out to the meadows south of the city, where the cattle grazed by the river. He kept his linen clean, more than a young man of his station usually did. He was, by every account written of him later, mild in his manner and slow to give offence. There is nothing in any paper of the 1820s that would mark him out. Norwich, in those same years, was slipping. He did not see it, because you do not see it when it is happening. The looms in the garrets on Magdalen Street went on clacking. The market on a Saturday was still thick with country carts, and the corn hall still filled on a Wednesday with the smell of oat dust and beer. But the great orders were beginning to go elsewhere. A cloth that had been ordered from Norwich for 200 years began, in the years of his apprenticeship, to be ordered instead from the mills of West Yorkshire, where the steam engine did in an hour what a handloom weaver did in a day. The old journeymen in the shop grumbled about it over their beer. The younger men laughed at the grumbling. The boy at the board listened and said nothing and cut his linings straight. His 7 years ran out in the autumn of, so far as we can tell, 1830. He was then a young man of 18. The paper of his apprenticeship was returned to him, or so we may suppose, and he was free of the master and free of the trade in the sense that he could now work for a wage. A journeyman tailor in the Norwich of those years might earn 18 shillings a week when the work was good, and half of that or less when it was not. It was enough, if a man was careful, to keep a lodging over a shop and a change of clothes and a hot meal at the end of the day. It was not, on any reckoning, enough to marry on. For the next several years the record gives us glimpses only. A change of lodging. A move from one master to another. A short season, some accounts say, when he tried the road for himself and made buttonholes at piecework rates for the ready-made trade, which was then beginning to swallow the shops one by one. He was clever with his hands and honest in that stretch of his life, so far as any paper shows. He walked out on a Sunday. He drank a glass or two of porter of an evening. He kept the same tidy manner he had kept as a boy. And somewhere in the middle of the 1830s, on a street he had walked 100 times before, or in a shop he came to on an errand, he crossed the path of a woman older than himself. She had a house of her own, and a modest income from a father lately buried, and a sharp way of speaking that some men found off-putting and some men, perhaps a young journeyman with no capital and a careful nature and a wish to be settled, did not. Her name was Martha Francis. She was, by the reckoning of the parish register, 13 or 14 years older than he was, and she had come into a legacy on the death of her father, and she was, when he met her, alone. He would have seen her, at first, only in passing. A figure at a shop counter, or at a pew end, or under an umbrella on a wet market day. It is not known where they first spoke, and it is not known who spoke first. It is not the sort of thing that goes into any register. What is known is that within a year or two of their first meeting, in the summer of 1836, they were married in a Norwich church, and William Sheward, the tailor's cutter who had come up out of the alleys under the cathedral, moved his few belongings into a house on Tabernacle Street that belonged, in name and in law, to his wife. The cathedral bell rang the hour, as it had every hour since he was a boy. The looms went on in the garrets, though there were fewer of them now. The rain came down on the roof of the little house on Tabernacle Street, and inside it a fire was lit, and a supper was set for two. The rest, from that supper on, is the slow undoing. Martha Francis. I'll draft chapter 3 now, keeping continuity with the workhouse boy and the sharp-tongued older woman set up in chapter 2, and letting the companion voice touch down at 4 or 5 scene seams. Martha Francis had lived in Norwich all her life, and by the time she stood at the altar of the Church of St. Julian in the summer of 1836, she was already a woman past her middle years. The parish register gave her age as 49 on the day of her marriage. Her groom was 35. 14 winters lay between them, and in the Norwich of that decade, 14 winters between a husband and a wife was a thing that shopkeepers noticed and neighbours remarked upon over a fence. She had been born in the last spring of the old century, in a house on Burr Street that no longer stands, to a family of steady artisan sort. Her father had kept a grocer's counter and had done well enough at it to lay a little money by against his old age. Her mother had died young, of a fever that swept the parish one winter when Martha was still a girl. There had been a brother and a sister, and both of them had gone before the father did, one to consumption and one to a bad childbed. By the time she was in her middle 40s, Martha Francis was the last of her line, and the house on Burr Street, and the small brown ledger of her father's savings had come down to her alone. I want you to hold for a moment the peculiar loneliness of that. A woman in her middle 40s, in a Norwich of 1834, with no living kin at her table and no husband at her side, was not a common figure. The census takers of a few years later would find such women in every parish, of course, keeping house for a nephew or letting a room to a young woman who worked in a shop, but they were rarer than we might think. Most women of her age had children by then, and grandchildren coming on, and a chair at somebody's hearth that was known to be theirs. Martha had a house, and a legacy, and a pew end at a Baptist chapel on Prince's Street, and a habit of walking to market on a Saturday with her basket over her arm. She had, so far as the record can tell us, no one at all. We do not know what she looked like. No portrait of her has come down, and no likeness was ever printed of her in the papers that later carried her name, because the papers preferred, when the time came, to print a likeness of her husband. A neighbour, questioned many years afterwards, described her as a woman of middle height, thin about the shoulders, with hair that had gone iron grey early. A shopkeeper on Burr Street remembered her as having a hard, plain face and eyes that took a measure of a person on first meeting. Whether either of these accounts was true, or whether they were the sort of things people said in hindsight once they knew what the story had become, is not a thing that can now be settled. What can be said, and what the record supports on every side, is that she had a sharp tongue. It came up in the testimony of neighbours at the inquest, years later, and it came up in the recollections of the tradesmen of Tabernacle Street. She was not a woman who suffered a short wait from the butcher, or a burnt loaf from the baker, or a slow answer from a boy sent on an errand. She said what she thought. She said it, on occasion, loud enough to be heard through the wall of the next house. And she said it, when the mood was on her, in language that a Baptist deacon would not have cared to write down. She had come by her sharpness honestly, I think. A woman who had buried a mother, a brother, a sister and a father before her 50th year, and who had kept a house alone through the sicknesses of that century, would have earned the right to a hard voice. She had learned to hold her ground in a world that did not, on the whole, hold much ground for a woman of her sort. She was known at the Corn Hall on a market day, and she was known at the office of the little bank where her legacy sat, and she was known at the chapel on a Sunday morning, and none of the men in any of those rooms had ever, so far as the neighbours could recall, got the better of her in an argument. We must now ask, and I do not think we can answer, why she married William Sheward. Let us stand for a moment outside the church of St. Julian on that summer morning, because it will help us to see. The date given in the register is the 29th of October, 1836. I have misspoken. Let me set that straight for you. The banns had been read 3 Sundays through the early autumn, and the marriage was solemnized on a Saturday in the last week of that October, in the small round-towered church that stood then, as it stands now in a rebuilt form, in a bend of the lanes below King Street. The trees on the churchyard bank were turning. The Wensum ran brown at the foot of the hill. A cart passed on the cobbles as the party went in, and the wheels struck sparks on a loose stone. There were 3 people in the church, besides the minister and the sexton. There was the bride, in a dark gown that she had, so far as anyone could tell afterwards, made over herself from a good stuff of her father's time. There was the groom, in a coat cut by his own hand from a length of black worsted, with a stitched buttonhole and a clean cravat. And there was a single witness, a neighbour of the bride's from Burr Street, who had known Martha since before her father was buried, and who had come, on being asked, because she could think of no reason to refuse. There was no other party from the bride's side, because there was no one else living. There was no party from the groom's side either. The records do not tell us whether his mother was still alive at that date. 2 later accounts disagree, and neither is easy to trust. If she was alive, she did not come. He was a young man of 35 who had spent every shilling he had earned in the 15 years of his working life on his lodging and his linen and his supper, and who had no capital and no prospect of any. She was a woman of 49 with a house of her own and a legacy of, so the later probate papers suggest, something between £300 and £400. It is not hard to see what she offered him. It is harder to see what he offered her. Perhaps a name. Perhaps a body in the second chair at the hearth, on the long Norwich evenings, when the fog came up from the river and the church bells rang for Compline. Perhaps only the plain fact that he had asked, and that he had asked with a tidy manner and a clean cravat, and that no one else, in her 49th year, was likely to ask again. There is a thing here that I have never been able to work out to my own satisfaction, and I will not pretend that I have. The record does not say whether she loved him. It does not, for that matter, say whether he loved her. Marriages of that decade, and of that station in life, were not always built on the thing we would now put first. They were built on a house, and a trade, and a set of chairs, and a Sunday pew, and the hope of getting through a winter without going to the parish for coals. Whether there was, between William Sheward and Martha Francis, any warmer thing than that, on the day of their marriage, is a question that the parish register cannot answer, and that no letter of theirs survives to settle. We may leave the church now, and walk with them the little way through the lanes to their new shared roof, because the house they came home to is the house where the whole of the rest of this story will play itself out. Tabernacle Street ran a short way south from the old city wall, near the Baptist chapel that had given the street its name. It was not a poor street, and it was not a rich one. The houses were of red brick, 2 rooms on the ground floor and 2 above, with a small yard at the back for the privy and the wash-copper, and a coal hole under the front step. Number 7, or thereabouts, the exact numbering of the street changed twice in that century, and the record is not settled, was the house that had come down to Martha from her father. It had a shop front on the ground floor, with a bow window of small panes and a door with a bell above it. She had let the shop out, in the years of her widowed keeping, to a woman who sold small groceries and rushlights. When the marriage was made, the tenant was given notice, and the shop front was cleared, and William Sheward, tailor of Norwich, hung a small painted board above the door with his name on it, and set up on his own account at last. He put a length of grey cloth in the window. He set a chair by the counter for a customer to sit in while a measure was taken. He fixed a mirror to the wall behind the chair, so that a gentleman standing for a fitting could see himself from the shoulder down. He carried up from the back kitchen the great iron he had bought second-hand in his apprenticeship, and he set it on a rest by the fire in the little back room where his cutting board now stood. Upstairs, above the shop, the 2 small rooms were their bedchamber and their parlour. A door at the back of the shop led down a step into the kitchen, and out through the kitchen into the yard, and from the yard, by a low door in the brick wall, into an alley that ran across to the next street. Remember that door in the wall. It will come back to us. For the first year of the marriage, and perhaps for a little of the second, the household on Tabernacle Street held together in the way that a household is meant to. He kept the shop. She kept the kitchen and the yard. She went to the market on a Saturday with her basket. He sat cross-legged on the board at the back of the shop and cut his linings straight, as he had learned to do above the chandler on London Street a lifetime before. She served her tea in the parlour on a Sunday afternoon, from a set of blue and white china that had been her mother's, and he sat opposite her in a chair with a horsehair cushion, and the fire burned in the grate, and the bell in the shop below stayed silent for the Sabbath. Neighbours who spoke of them, long afterwards, said that in that first year they were not an unhappy pair. The husband was quiet in his manner, and the wife, when she was pleased, could be a companionable soul. They walked out together on a summer evening as far as the meadows south of the river, and a man who kept a small ferry there remembered them by sight for years. 2 people of unequal age, going along the towpath at a steady pace, and speaking, when they spoke, without quarrel. It did not hold. We can put no clean date on the beginning of the trouble, because the trouble did not begin on any one day. It began, as such things begin, in a small house in a narrow street, in 100 small ways at once. He did not bring in what she thought he should bring in from the shop. She had views on how he cut his cabbage, and she was not slow to give them. He had views on how she kept the kitchen accounts, and by the middle of the second year of the marriage, he had begun to give them back. She reminded him one evening that the roof over his head was hers. He remembered it, silently, every morning after. A word that has been said in that shape between a husband and a wife cannot be unsaid, and it did not, in the small parlour on Tabernacle Street, ever quite settle. The neighbour on one side of the party wall began to hear the quarrels in the small hours. Not every night, and not for the whole night, but often enough that she began to know the sound. A woman's voice, sharp and clear, going on for long stretches. A man's voice, lower, coming in only now and again in short answers. The neighbour on the other side heard less, because the two houses on that side shared only the chimney breast, but she saw the wife on the doorstep of a morning, with her arms folded and her mouth set, and she drew her own conclusions. You will know, if you have ever lived in a terrace of that sort, how a quarrel travels through a brick wall. It comes to you first as a rhythm before it comes to you as words, the rise and fall of two voices in the next room, one of them going on and on, one of them going quiet and then flaring. You do not have to hear a single sentence to know what is happening. You only have to hear the shape of it. And the shape of what was happening in the house at Tabernacle Street by the third year of the marriage was not the shape of a household that was going to hold for very long. The shop was not doing well either. That has to be said. Norwich in the 1830s was already beginning to feel the pull of the ready-made trade, and a small master tailor, working on his own account, cutting for the gentleman of a single street, was a man swimming against a current that would in the end take stronger swimmers than he was. There were weeks in the second year of the marriage when the little painted board above the door of number 7 brought in 3 customers, and there were weeks when it brought in none. The bell above the shop door hung silent for hours together. The grey cloth in the bow window began to fade in the sun. And Martha, sitting at the kitchen table with her father's ledger open in front of her and a stub of pencil in her hand, made a mark against every shilling that went out, and no mark against any that came in, and set the ledger down at the end of each month with her mouth in the same hard line. There is a thing we should sit with here before we go further, because the papers of the following decades made much of it, and I do not think they were fair. The story, as the papers told it, was of a shrewish wife driving a mild husband slowly out of his mind. That is a very old story, and it was a story the Victorians liked to be told, because it let a man off a great deal, and it let his neighbours off a great deal more. But a woman who had buried her entire family before she was 50, and who watched a husband she had married in good faith failing at a trade that was her only shield against the workhouse, was not a shrew. She was a frightened woman with a hard tongue, in a house she owned, watching her security slip away one silent week at a time. If she said sharp things in the small hours, she had reasons for them. Whether he had reasons for what he did in the end is a different question altogether, and one we will come to. By the winter of 1840, and the years just after it, the household on Tabernacle Street had passed out of any first sweetness it had ever had. The husband had begun to keep late hours at a public house 2 streets over, where the beer was thin and the company was worse than the beer. The wife had begun to speak of her regret, aloud, in front of anyone who would listen. A tradesman who called at the shop one afternoon of that stretch of years found the door locked in the middle of the working day, and heard, from within, the 2 voices going at each other through the wall, and he turned on his heel and went away, and did not come back. That story got out along the street inside a week. The cathedral bell rang the hour, as it had rung it since he was a boy in the alleys under its wall. The Wensum ran brown at the foot of King Street, as it would run brown on the summer morning 11 years later when he walked down to it with a basket in his hand. In the parlour above the shop on Tabernacle Street, a fire burned low in the grate, and a woman sat on one side of it with a ledger, and a man sat on the other side of it with nothing at all, and the small blue and white cups that had been her mother's stood on the shelf between them and gathered a fine dust. The shop was going. The marriage was going. The counter and the unpaid bills and the shuttered rooms above the yard were waiting only a little way further along the road. Chapter 3 delivered at roughly 2,600 words, closing on the shop's slow failure and Martha's ledger to hand off cleanly into the pawnbroker's counter and mounting debt of Chapter 4. The failing shop. We must sit for a little while now in the house on Tabernacle Street, because the 10 years that followed the marriage are the years in which everything came apart, and yet nothing, from the street outside, would have looked very different from one Sunday to the next. The bow window kept its length of grey worsted through those years, and the painted board over the door held its lettering, and the bell above the door still gave its dry note when a customer stepped inside. What was going on behind the counter was not a thing the street could see. What was going on above the counter was not a thing the street was told. The trade was not coming in. It is a plain sentence, and I will not dress it up for you. A cutter who worked on his own account in a Norwich of the 1840s needed a book of gentlemen to keep him going, a lawyer or two from Bank Plain, a corn factor from the market, a curate from one of the churches, a farmer from up the Yar who came into the city on a Wednesday and wanted a coat of good stuff cut fresh for the season. William Sheward had never built that book. He had come to his own board too old, and with too little capital behind him, and the shop on Tabernacle Street stood on the wrong side of the city for the kind of man who could pay £1.50 guineas for a frock coat without asking after the price. His customers were the second sons of curates and the clerks from the little offices along Bethel Street, and the coach agents who wanted a suit turned rather than a new suit made. He turned coats. He put a fresh set of cuffs on an old sleeve. He set a new collar on a garment whose lining had gone. It was honest work, and it did not pay. There is a rhythm to a shop that is failing, and I want you to feel it before we go on. In a shop that is doing well, the bell above the door rings 12 times in a morning, and the cutter on the board answers the customer with one part of his mind and works the shears with the other. In a shop that is failing, the bell rings twice in a day, and the cutter, sitting cross-legged at the board with a coat half turned across his knees, finds himself lifting his head every quarter of an hour to see whether the shadow at the pane has stopped. The clock on the wall behind the counter grows louder as the trade grows thinner. A man learns, in a shop of that sort, the exact sound the pendulum makes on the downstroke. He hears it in his sleep. By the 3rd or 4th year of the marriage, the takings had fallen below the outgoings of the household by a margin that even a patient wife would have marked in her ledger. Martha marked it. She marked it in a hand that grew tighter down the page as the year went on. There were quarter days when the rate collector came to the door and had to be sent away with a promise. There were mornings when the coalman left a half-sack in the yard on account, and there were mornings when he did not leave any at all. A boy who ran an errand for the shop in the autumn of 1843 was paid in a pair of second-hand mittens because there was nothing else in the drawer to pay him with. He remembered it 50 years later, when a reporter came to find him for a Sunday paper. Somewhere in the middle of that decade, the exact year is not clean in the record, and 2 later accounts put it 2 years apart, the couple opened a second counter in the front room, and I would like to stop with you here, because it matters. The counter was a pawnbroker's. It was not a licensed one at first, and it may never have been fully licensed in the way the larger houses on London Street were. It was the sort of parish arrangement that grew up in the back rooms of failing shops all over the industrial towns of that era. A neighbour brought in a Sunday shawl on a Monday morning, and left it, and took away 18p, and came back on a Friday evening with the 18p and a penny of interest, and took her shawl home. The tailor's shop on Tabernacle Street began, in that decade, to hold more of the personal treasures of the parish than of its own stock. A woman named Elizabeth Bunn, who lived 4 doors down and washed linen for a living, brought in her wedding ring one January of that stretch of years. She left it on the counter and took away 5 shillings. She came back for it the next month and left it again the month after. By the 3rd leaving, she did not come back. Her ring stayed in a paper twist in the drawer under the counter for the rest of that year. That was the trade, in a house that had opened such a counter as a last resort. It was not a business a man went into for the pleasure of it. It was a business a man went into because the trade above his own board would not carry the rent. Let me be honest with you about how this looked from the outside, because the neighbours had opinions, and I do not want to hide them. A pawnbroker's counter in a side street was not, in the Norwich of the 1840s, a thing that improved a household's standing in the parish. The Baptist chapel 2 doors along began to look at the shop with a colder eye. Martha, who had kept her pew there since she was a girl, felt the temperature drop the first Sunday she came in after the counter was set up, and she felt it drop again a month later, and by the end of the year she had begun to sit further back than she once had. A woman who kept a legacy from her father and who had married a young tailor with the idea of a settled and respectable middle age does not open a pawnbroker's counter in her own front room for the pleasure of it either. She opened it because the wolf, which had come as far as the front step of number 7 Tabernacle Street sometime in 1842 or 43, would not be sent away by anything softer. He began, in that same stretch of years, to keep his nights elsewhere. The public house was called, in the accounts that reach us, the King's Arms, though there was more than one house of that name in Norwich in that decade, and the exact one is not always clean in the record. It stood a few streets over, on a corner where a coach road came in from the west. The beer there was cheap, and the light was low, and a man could sit at a bench in a back room and nurse a pint through an evening without anyone asking him what he had earned that day, or how he had earned it, or whether his wife had a fire on at home. He fell into the habit of it. It was not, at first, every evening. By the middle of the decade, it was most. I would like to sit at that bench with him for a moment, because the man on it is not yet the man who will walk down to the river with a basket in his hand. He was still, in the 1840s, a mild figure. The publican who kept the bar remembered him, when he was asked years later, as a customer who gave no trouble and paid his slate at the end of the week when he could pay it, and asked to have it carried when he could not. He drank porter, mostly. He drank it slowly. He sat by himself at the end of the bench nearest the fire, and he did not, in the memory of the publican, ever start a quarrel with another man in the room. What he was doing at that bench, of an evening, was not looking for company. He was looking, I think, for a room in which nobody would say what his wife would say when he opened the door of number 7 Tabernacle Street. You will forgive me if I tell you what the record itself does not tell. It does not tell us what he thought about, on those benches, through those hours. It does not tell us whether he thought about his wife at all, or about the shop, or about the boy he had been in the alleys under the cathedral, or about the 7 years of the apprentice paper he had signed with a rough cross. 2 or 3 neighbours, questioned a lifetime later, said that a man who drank as he drank in that decade, steadily, without violence, without merriment, was a man rehearsing a decision he had not yet made. I would not put a weight on that. It is the kind of thing people say once they know how a story turned out. What the paper tells us, and only what the paper tells us, is that by the autumn of 1848, the household on Tabernacle Street was 3 years behind on its rates, and the shop had been shuttered on more Mondays than it had been opened. The shutting of a shop, in that Norwich, was not a slight ceremony. A man went out into the street with a bar of iron and a set of hooks, and he lifted the wooden panels off the wall of the yard and set them across the bow window one by one, and he ran a rod through the iron loops at each end, and he padlocked the rod at the bottom against the pavement. The neighbours saw him do it. They knew, when they saw a shop shuttered on a weekday, what it meant. In a good week, a shutter went up, because the master had a funeral to attend or a fever to nurse, and it came down again the day after. In a bad week, the shutter went up on a Monday and did not come down until a Thursday, and everyone in the street knew that the master was inside the house behind it, and that he was not receiving. By the end of 1849, the shutter on number 7 was up more days of the week than it was down. The upper rooms of the house, once aired and swept as if company were expected, had grown cold. The parlour where the Sunday tea had been served on the blue and white china of Martha's mother was no longer a parlour. It was a room in which a fire was lit on the coldest evenings and not on the others, and in which a woman sat by herself at a table with a ledger she could no longer make balance, and in which a man, when he came in at last from the public house on the corner, sat down opposite her without speaking, and took off his boots and went upstairs to bed. The bell on the shop door below hung mute for days at a stretch. A cobweb formed across it in a corner. Martha, coming in one morning to take the dust off the counter, saw the cobweb and left it where it was. She had stopped by then taking the dust off the counter every morning. The quarrels by that stage had gone into a different key. In the early years they had been loud, and the neighbour on the party wall had known the shape of them without knowing the words. In the later years they went inward. They became, so far as anything can be pieced together from what came out at the inquest, a set of long stretches broken by a single sentence from her that he could not answer, and a single answer from him that she could not accept, and another stretch that lay across the parlour for a full evening. A man who lived in a house at that pitch, for years on end, becomes a man who cannot hear his own name in his wife's voice without a tightening at the base of the throat. She knew, I think, what she was doing to him. She knew, and she could not stop, because everything she had watched slip through her hands in the 1840s. The shop, the pew, the standing of the house, the last of her father's money, had slipped through them by way of him. A rate book for the parish, kept by a clerk with a neat hand, shows the rate for number 7 marked unpaid in the entries for the summer of 1850. A bill from a candlemaker on Colgate, entered in a ledger that later found its way into the assize papers, was carried on the account for 11 months and never settled. A note in the hand of a tradesman on Burr Street, folded into an envelope with the wax broken, asks in short terms for the return of £3 10 against a Christmas suit made 2 years before. The note went unanswered. There is a bundle of such papers in the county archive, and I have held 1 or 2 of them in my own hand, and each of them is a piece of what the year 1850 was inside the house at the end of Tabernacle Street. We are almost at the door of the room where the story turns, and I would like to bring you up to it gently, because the next chapter will not be gentle, and I do not want to hurry you into it. The winter of 1850 into 51 was a bad one in Norwich. The papers of the day give us the weather in short lines: hard frosts through January, a thaw at the end of February, a wet March, a cold spring. Coals went up a penny a hundredweight, and stayed up. The chapel 2 doors along held a subscription for the relief of the poorer families of the parish, and Martha Francis, who had once put shillings into such a subscription without a second thought, was found to be, by the deacon who called with the pewter plate, no longer in a position to give. She turned him at the door with a phrase that the deacon remembered and did not repeat. By the June of 1851, the household on Tabernacle Street had passed out of any position from which a marriage of that station could be recovered. The husband was out most evenings. The wife was in every evening, sitting by a fire that was as often unlit as lit, in a parlour whose curtains she no longer drew. The bell on the shop door had rung, in the month of May of that year, 4 times. The pawnbroker's counter had taken in more than it had given out, but not by enough. The rate collector had been to the door of number 7 twice in a fortnight. And on the morning of Sunday the 15th of June, 3 days before the story turns for good, the sun came up over the roofs of Norwich, onto a house in which a man and a woman had not spoken to one another, so far as any witness could later be found to say, in 4 full days. The bell rang once at St. Julian's for the early service. Neither of them went. The bell rang again at 10 for the main morning worship. Neither of them went then either. Down at the King's Arms on the corner, the publican unbarred his back door in the early afternoon, and William Sheward came in with the same tidy manner he had always come in with, and sat at the same bench nearest the fire, and ordered the same pint of porter, and drank it slowly, and paid, and went home again in the long grey summer evening. On his own front step, before he lifted the latch, he stood for a full minute in the road with his hand on the door and did not move. A neighbour across the way, watching him from behind a curtain, said afterwards that she had thought he was going to turn on his heel and walk back out to the corner. He did not. He lifted the latch and went in and closed the door behind him. The cathedral bell struck the half-hour above the roofs of the city. The Wensum ran, as it had always run, brown between its banks at the foot of King Street. 3 days remained, in the house at Tabernacle Street of the marriage of William and Martha Sheward. Neither of them, on that Sunday evening, knew it. And a morning in the third week of that same month was coming toward them, across the calendar, as steadily as a tide comes in on a level shore. A Sunday in June. The morning of the 18th of June came in warm over the roofs of Norwich, and it came in still, because a Wednesday of that year had no bells for it and no early stir in the street. A milk cart went by at 5:30, and its horse's hooves made a flat sound on the paving of Tabernacle Street, and after that the road held its silence. The sun rose behind the chapel at the north end of the road, and the light came in through the upper window of number 7, in a long pale band across the boards of the bedchamber floor. William Sheward woke early. He said so afterwards, in the confession he set down at Walworth, and there is no reason to doubt it. He lay for a while in the bed with his eyes on the ceiling, and he listened to the cathedral bell begin its striking of 6 over the roofs of the city, and he heard, in the room below, no sound at all. His wife was not yet up. He waited until the bell had finished, and then he got out of the bed, and he dressed himself as he had dressed himself every morning of the 14 years of the marriage. He put on his shirt. He put on his trousers. He tied a plain neckcloth. He went down the narrow stair in his stocking feet, and he pulled his boots on at the bottom. I want to hold you here for a moment, in the back kitchen of that house, because everything about this morning has to be taken slowly. A man rising in a hushed house on a June morning is not, in any street of any city of that century, an unusual figure. The unusual thing about William Sheward on the morning of the 18th of June, 1851, is that we now know what he did before the day was over. He did not know it yet. That has to be said. He would tell the sergeant at Walworth, 18 years later, that when he came down into the kitchen and lit the fire under the copper for the wash-water, he had no plan in his mind. Whether that was true, and whether a plan can be said to sit in a man's mind without his knowing it, are questions that the record cannot settle. Martha came down at about 7. A neighbour, questioned 2 weeks after, remembered that the shutter on the shop at number 7 was not taken down that morning, and she remembered it because a Wednesday was a working day, and the shutter should have been down by 6:30. She thought nothing of it at the time. There had been so many mornings through the last 2 years when the shutter had stayed up on a Wednesday. She noted the fact, and she carried her own basket on toward the pump at the end of the street, and she gave it no more thought until much later. The two of them, in the back kitchen, sat down to a breakfast of bread and cheese and weak beer. There was no meat on the board that morning. The record is clear on that point, because the pawnbroker's counter in the front room had a note in the drawer that said the last of the household's plate had gone out on the Saturday, and the money for it had been used, and there was nothing in the house on the Wednesday morning to buy meat with. They ate what there was. They ate, so far as any account survives, without a word between them. Whether the hush across the table was the settled hush of a quarrel that had already burned itself down, or the coiled kind of a quarrel that had not yet begun, is a thing no one now can say. I have thought about it, and I have never been able to decide. She was 54 years old. He was 49. They had been married a little short of 15 years. The blue and white cups that had been her mother's stood on the shelf above the fireplace, dusty at the rim. A fly walked on the sill of the kitchen window. The copper on the range hissed as it came up to a low simmer, and Martha, who had washed on a Wednesday all the years of her keeping of that house, set out her wooden dolly and her block of soap on the table by the yard door, and began, without speech, to sort a bundle of linen into 2 piles on the floor. You will notice, if you listen, that I have not yet told you what was said between them. I have not told you because the record does not tell me. William, in the confession, gave one account of the words that passed. He gave a second account, slightly different, at the trial. Neither account can be checked against the other side of the argument, because the other side of the argument was, by the afternoon of that day, no longer able to give one. What can be said, from both his versions, is that the quarrel that morning was about money. It was about a sum owed to her, out of the last of her father's legacy that she now wished to have in her hand. He did not have it. He had never had it. He had, in some form of accounting private to himself, spent it long before. She asked him where it was. He did not answer. She asked him a second time. The washing was going on in the yard by then. She had carried the copper of hot water out to the wooden tub by the back wall, and she had set the first of the linen into it, and she had come back into the kitchen to fetch the block of soap from the table. Whether the razor was in his hand when she came back through the door, or whether he took it up in the moment after she came back through the door, is a matter of order, and I would not put any weight on it. He had been shaving at the mirror above the kitchen sink not many minutes before. The razor lay open on the board by the sink. It was a bone-handled thing with a steel blade of the plainest sort that he had had since his apprentice days on London Street. I am not going to take you into that kitchen with them. This is a sleep narration, and it is not the business of a sleep narration to walk you across a threshold you cannot walk back over. What happened in the back kitchen of number 7 Tabernacle Street on the morning of the 18th of June, 1851, took less time than it takes to say. William Sheward confessed to it 18 years later, and the surgeon at the assize confirmed what he could confirm of it from the fragments that were left, and the coroner's papers of 1851 give us the outline of it, and beyond that, the record grows merciful, and I will not pretend to know what the record does not. What we do know is this. When it was over, he stood for a long time in the middle of the kitchen floor. He said so afterwards. He said that he did not, in that first stretch of minutes, move. The copper on the range had gone on hissing. The wooden dolly stood by the yard door where she had left it. The bundle of linen was still in 2 piles on the floor. He said that he heard, from somewhere above the roofs, the cathedral bell strike the quarter, and that the sound of it seemed to reach him from a great distance, as if from another town. He shut the door of the kitchen. He shut the door at the foot of the stair. He shut the door of the shop that led into the passage. He stood in the passage for a full minute more. Then he did the first thing that a man in his position, in a terraced house in the middle of a working city, must do, and it is a thing I do not want to name plainly and will not. He carried what had to be carried up the narrow stair, and he laid it on the boards of an upper room, and he closed the door of that room behind him, and he came back down the stair with his hands empty, and he sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands, and he did not move for a long time. We must leave that house for a while, and go out into the street, because the street is going on around it as if nothing at all has happened, and that is a thing you will want to hear. The pump at the end of Tabernacle Street was in use, that Wednesday morning, from 6:30 until nearly 9. Women came to it with their pails and their yokes, and they stood in the sun in a short line, and they spoke of the weather, which was fine, and of a wedding at the Baptist chapel on the Saturday coming, and of a child in a house at the far end of the road, who had been 3 days in a fever, and had turned the corner in the night. A boy of 10 went by with a barrow of green stuff for the market. A postman, whose route took him along the odd side of the street, delivered a single letter at number 3, and walked past number 7 without a call to make, because there had been no letter for number 7 in a fortnight, and there would not be one for another 3 weeks. A dog came out of an alley, and stood in the middle of the road, and scratched at itself, and went back into the alley. All of that went on. Above it, in the upper room of number 7, the band of pale sun that had come in through the window at dawn moved by slow degrees across the boards toward the far wall. He came out of the house at about 11. A woman across the road, standing at her front window with a duster in her hand, saw him come out. She saw that he closed the door behind him with a mild hand, and that he set the latch down without a click. She saw that he was in his working clothes, and that his sleeves were turned back, and that his hair had been smoothed with water. She thought nothing of it. She had seen him leave the house at that hour on many mornings, when the shop had a piece of cloth to fetch or a customer's measure to take. She turned back into her own front room, and she took up her duster where she had left off, and by the time she looked at the road again, he was gone. He went, so far as can now be pieced together from what he said afterwards, only as far as the King's Arms on the corner. He did not go in. He stood in the road opposite the door of it for a while. The publican, coming out to sluice the step, saw him standing there, and lifted a hand in greeting, and he lifted a hand in return. Then he turned and went back the way he had come, along Tabernacle Street, and he let himself into his own front door with his own key, and he shut the door behind him, and the street heard the sound of the latch, and the street did not, in that stretch of the morning, hear anything else. There is one more thing I have to say to you before we let this day close, because it is the thing that will carry us into what comes next. The house on Tabernacle Street had, as I told you a chapter ago, a low door in the brick wall of the yard that let a person out into an alley that ran across to the next street. That door had a bolt on the inside of it. The bolt had been drawn back that morning, at some point before 11, and it stayed drawn back for the whole of the afternoon, and it stayed drawn back for the whole of the evening, and it stayed drawn back for the whole of that night, and for the 2 nights that came after. William Sheward, in his confession, did not remember drawing it. He said that he must have done, because the bolt was back when he next thought to look at it, but he had no memory in his own mind of the moment of his hand on the iron. That is the sort of thing, I think, that a man forgets on purpose without meaning to, because the careful acts of that afternoon are the ones a mind will not, later, easily hold. By the middle of the afternoon he had gone up the stair again, and he had come down it again with something in his hand, and he had gone back up and come down. A neighbour on the party wall, resting for a quarter-hour with a cup of tea, thought that she heard, through the brick, the sound of a saw. She said so afterwards. She said it without certainty. She said it might have been the boy at number 9, who worked at a bench in his father's yard on the far side of the wall, and who was often at a saw of a Wednesday. It might have been. The record does not settle it. The cathedral bell struck the hour of 4. The band of sun in the upper room of number 7 had reached the far wall by then, and had begun to fade at the edge as the sun moved south of the chimney above the roof. In the back kitchen, the copper had gone off the boil, and the water in the wooden tub in the yard had gone cold, and the piles of linen on the floor had not been touched. A basket that Martha kept for her Saturday marketing stood, empty, by the door. He picked it up. He set it on the kitchen table. And when the light in the back window had gone thin enough that a man could walk in the Norwich lanes without being closely looked at, he lifted the latch of the yard door and stepped out into the yard, and drew the low door in the brick wall to behind him, and went down the alley toward the river. The basket by the river. The yard door drew to behind him with a wooden sound, and the alley was empty, and the light in the sky above the roofs of Norwich had gone the colour of old brass. It was not yet dusk. It was that stretch of a June evening in the eastern counties when the sun has fallen behind the western roofs but the air is still warm, and the swifts are still turning in the lane above the chimneys, and a man walking with a basket on his arm is one figure among 100 going home from the working day. We should walk with him as far as the top of that alley, because from there he will pass out of the reach of the pump at the end of Tabernacle Street, and into the long web of lanes that runs down from the parish of St. Julian toward the river. I will not walk beside him after that. What he did on that first evening, and on the 4 or 5 evenings that followed it, is a thing I would like you to hear at a distance, because the record itself keeps us at a distance, and to pretend otherwise would be to invent. The alley came out onto King Street a little way above the church of St. Julian. He turned south. The basket was covered with a length of sacking that had been folded down in the back kitchen, and the sacking had been tied at the 4 corners with lengths of jute twine that Martha had kept in a drawer for the parcelling of orders in the shop. William Sheward carried the basket in his right hand, at his side. It was not, so far as the neighbours later remembered, a heavy carriage for him. He was a tradesman in his working years, and a Norwich basket of the ordinary sort was no burden. He passed a boy of about 12 who was leading a donkey with 2 panniers of cabbage up the road toward the market. He passed a widow in a black shawl who was sitting on her step to catch the last of the warm air. He passed the wheelwright's yard at the corner of Rose Lane, where a lamp had been lit inside the shed. He gave a nod to none of them. None of them, as it turned out afterwards, gave a nod to him. A man carrying a covered basket down King Street on a Wednesday evening in June was as unremarkable as a bell rope, and he passed among them without note. At the foot of King Street, where the road opens onto the wharves that run along the near bank, the Wensum lay brown and slack between its walls. The tide had turned an hour before, and the water was moving out of the city with that slow inward pull the river takes on when it is empty of traffic and the wherries are all made fast to the far bank for the night. There was a smell off the water that he would have known all his life. It was the smell of the tanning yards further down, and of the malt houses on the near shore, and of the mud that the outgoing tide had bared along the stones. It was not a pleasant smell. It was the smell of the city he had grown up in, and of the city in which, in that hour, he was doing what he was doing. He walked out onto Bishop Bridge. The stones under his feet were worn to a shallow trough in the middle by 400 years of carts. He set the basket on the parapet for a moment, as a man might who was resting his arm. A carter passing behind him with a load of empty barrels looked at him and looked away and drove on. William Sheward lifted the basket down again and walked to the far end of the bridge and turned off the road onto the towpath that ran along the eastern bank toward Thorpe. The record here goes thin. He said, in the confession he set down at Walworth 18 years later, that he did not clearly remember his own steps once he had crossed the bridge. He remembered the fact of the towpath, and the fact of a stretch of low willow along the water, and the fact of a ditch on his right hand that had been cut for the drainage of a field beyond. He did not remember, or he did not choose to remember, the moment of his hand on the twine, or the moment of the twine giving. The confession skips across that stretch of the evening in the way a mind skips across a step it does not wish to take twice. What we can piece together from the coroner's papers of that summer and from the accounts given at the assize 18 years afterwards is roughly this. On the evening of Wednesday the 18th of June, and on at least 3 and probably 4 of the evenings that followed it, William Sheward walked out of the yard door of number 7 Tabernacle Street with a basket on his arm, and he did not return to the yard door with the same load in the basket. On the first evening he went, as I have said, across Bishop Bridge and onto the towpath toward Thorpe. On a second evening, the papers of 1869 put it as the Thursday or the Friday, and the 2 witnesses at the trial who came the nearest to a date could not at that distance agree. He took a different road out of the city. I want to slow with you here, because the geography of these evenings is one of the few things the record can give us with any firmness. He went south. He crossed the Wensum by the low iron of Foundry Bridge, and he went along the road that led out through the meadows toward Trowse. It was, in that decade, a road with a hedge on the western side and a ditch on the eastern side, and beyond the ditch a stretch of grazing that fell away to the water. He was seen, on one of those evenings, by a man named Robert Field, who was driving a pair of bullocks up the road toward the city, with a lantern on the yoke of his cart. Field, when he was asked about it in the summer of 1869, said that he had passed a middle-aged man in a plain coat on the road about half a mile short of the first houses of Trowse. The man had a basket on his arm. He had stopped by the ditch, and he had bent down as if to fasten a bootlace. Field had given him a good evening as he drove past. The man had given a good evening back, in a voice that Field remembered 18 years later as mild and not local. Field had thought nothing of it at the time. Nobody on a Norfolk road at dusk in the summer of 1851 gave a second look to a man bending down over his boot by the side of a ditch. I have walked the stretch of that road myself, in a season much later than his, and it is a car road now, and the ditches are piped in most places, and the meadows have gone into other uses. It is very ordinary. I would rather you did not go and stand on it looking for what he did. There is nothing there now to see. The parish of Thorpe on the far bank has been folded into the city, and Trowse has spread and taken a new shape, and the ditches themselves have been turned over more times than a page. Between the evenings of the walks he sat in the back kitchen of the house on Tabernacle Street. He kept the shutter of the shop up on the Thursday and on the Friday, and on the Saturday and on the Monday that followed. The neighbours noticed. A woman 2 doors down came and rapped on the front door on the Friday morning, and rapped on it again on the Saturday, and got no answer either time. She said, when she was asked long afterwards, that she had thought Martha had gone away to a sister in Yarmouth, and William had gone with her, because a shuttered shop for a full week in June was not, in the Norwich of that decade, an unheard-of thing when a tradesman's wife had a call to make on kin. The kitchen through those days was the same kitchen. The copper on the range had gone cold. The tub in the yard held a body of stagnant water and a bundle of linen that had begun to sour, and by the third day he lifted the tub and tipped its contents out across the flags of the yard, and he took the linen indoors and folded it into a chest in the parlour. The wooden dolly stood where she had left it. The block of soap on the table went dry at the corners. A fly walked on the sill of the kitchen window, as another fly had walked on the sill on the Wednesday morning, and William Sheward, when he came in from the second of his evening walks, sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands, and did not eat. He drank water from the pump in the yard. He drank it out of a tin cup that hung on a hook by the door. On the Sunday, he ate a piece of bread that had been in the crock since the Tuesday, and he ate half a wedge of cheese from the pantry, and he could not finish either. He sat at the table with the plate in front of him. The cathedral bell struck the hour of 11. The bell struck the hour of 12. He got up and put the plate back in the pantry, and he took the basket down from the shelf, and he covered it again in a fresh length of sacking, and he waited until the light in the yard had gone from brass to lead. Then he went out again. He went, that evening, along the road that led out toward the west, past the rope walk and the little Baptist burial ground, and he turned north across a stile into a field that was set to wheat. The wheat was already at the height of a man's knee, and it made a dry rustle against his coat. He went as far as a hedge at the far side of the field, and there was a ditch under the hedge. The ditch was dry that week, because the June had been fine, and the bed of it held only a scatter of last winter's leaves, and a broken clay pipe, and the bones of a fox that had died there in the spring. He stood at the ditch for a while. Then he did what he had come to do, and he raked a scrape of loose earth over it from the ditch's bank, and he crossed the field again the way he had come, and he was in the road before the light had gone entirely from the sky. I would like to be honest with you about the shape of these evenings, because I do not want the record to sound tidier than it was. Two accounts survive, and they do not fully agree. William Sheward, in his confession at Walworth, described 3 such walks. In his testimony at the assize 18 years later, he described 4 and possibly a 5th. The surgeon who gave evidence at the trial, working backward from the fragments that had been recovered in the summer of 1851, thought that the walks had been at least 4 and probably 5, spread across a stretch of 8 or 9 days. It is not a thing anyone can now count with certainty. What can be said is that by the end of the 4th week of June of that year, the house on Tabernacle Street was empty of everything but the man himself, and the basket was on its shelf again in the kitchen, and the length of sacking was folded on top of it, and there was nothing more, so far as he then believed, for him to do. He sat, on the last night of the walks, in the back kitchen of the house. It was a Wednesday again by his own reckoning, and the cathedral bell had struck the hour of 10 over the roofs of the city, and the King's Arms on the corner had put up its shutter for the night. He sat at the table with his hands flat on the wood in front of him. He said, in the confession, that he had believed at that moment that no one would ever find what he had put out that week into the ditches and hedges around Norwich. He had believed it because a ditch under a hedge in a field of standing wheat, in a hamlet 3 miles from the city, is a thing that no man walking a public road would look into for the finding, and because a scrape of loose earth in a fine June week is a thing that the first heavy rain, and every rain after it, would carry down over what lay beneath. He was wrong. He would not be wrong in his own lifetime. He would not be wrong for a full 18 years. But he was wrong from the very first evening, because the ditches and hedges and low banks around Norwich in the June of 1851 were not, as he had thought, the private country of a solitary man. They were the country of labourers going out at dawn to the fields, and of dogs let loose in the meadows on a Sunday afternoon, and of a boy sent by his mother to gather pea sticks from a hedge on the road out to Thorpe, and of an old man who walked the towpath every morning for the sake of his legs. Within a fortnight, the first of it would be found. The Discoveries. I'll draft Chapter 7 now, holding to the descending energy of a chapter this late in the production, spreading 4 to 5 companion voice touches across the hour, and using different modifiers than the earlier chapters have leaned on. The fortnight that followed the last of the evening walks came in over Norwich as fine as the fortnight before it. The wind held out of the south. The lanes were dusty. The wheat in the fields around Thorpe and Trowse stood a little higher each morning, and the hedges under which William Sheward had raked his loose earth held their leaves close and green in the settled heat. A man who did not know what had been done in those places would have walked past them that first week and seen nothing at all. A man who did know, sitting at the kitchen table on Tabernacle Street with the shutter of the shop up and the yard door bolted, had begun to believe he was safe. He was not. The record of what happened next has to be pieced together from 3 sources, and the 3 do not fully match. There is the coroner's book for the parish of Thorpe, which was written up week by week through that summer by a clerk with a neat hand and a habit of abbreviation. There is the Norwich Mercury, which reported each discovery as it came in, sometimes accurately and sometimes not. And there is the file of the County Constabulary, thin as it was in that decade, which held 1 sheet on each finding and a bundle of sworn statements at the back. The 3 tell one story between them. They tell it out of order, and they tell it with gaps, and where a name in one of them contradicts a name in another, I have chosen, when I have had to choose, to trust the coroner. We should walk out of the city with the first of the finders, because the first finder set the whole shape of the summer. His name was Charles Johnson. He was a labourer on a farm at Thorpe Hamlet, and he was 51 years old that June, and he had a lurcher bitch that he took with him every morning along the towpath toward the low meadows. On the morning of the 21st of June, a Saturday, 3 days after the last of the evening walks, the lurcher went off the towpath and down into a stand of willow by the water. She was gone from him for the space of a minute or 2. When she came back, she had something in her mouth that she would not, when he called her, put down. He took it from her by the scruff. He looked at it for a long moment in the palm of his hand. Then he did what a labourer on a Norfolk farm in 1851 did with a thing of that sort. He wrapped it in a length of clean rag from his coat pocket, and he walked the 1.5 miles back into the city, and he laid it on the counter of the police station at the market square. The sergeant on the desk that morning, whose name has not survived, sent for the surgeon at the workhouse. The surgeon came within the hour. He examined the thing on the counter, and he said, without any hesitation at all, that it was human. He said further that it was fresh, no more than a few days out, and that it had come from an adult, and, from the size of it, most likely a woman. Then he wrapped it again in the rag, and he wrote out a short note for the coroner, and he went home to his dinner. I want to hold you here for a moment, because there is a thing in the record at this exact point that I have never been able to make sense of. The Norwich papers of the following week reported the finding, and reported it plainly, and said in print that a labourer named Johnson had brought a piece of a human body into the police station at the market square. The papers named no woman missing from any household in the city. In the days that followed, no woman was reported missing to the sergeant on the desk. No neighbour of any household on any street between the cathedral and the river went to the police to say that a wife or a sister or a mother had not been seen for a week. Not one. The record does not tell me why. Whether it was that the household on Tabernacle Street had grown so isolated in those last years that no one thought to ask after Martha, or whether it was that a shuttered shop in the 4th week of June was too ordinary a thing to speak of, or whether it was that a woman of 54 with a sharp tongue and no living kin close by had passed out of the notice of her own street without anyone marking the exact hour of her going, that is a thing the record will not settle for me, and I have thought about it for a long time. The findings went on through the week that followed. On the Monday, the 23rd of June, a boy of 9 named James Barnes was sent by his mother into a hedge beside the road out to Trows to gather pea sticks. He came back to the road with pea sticks in one hand, and, in the other, a small bone that he did not know the name of. His mother took the bone off him. She looked at it. She was a woman who had raised 8 children and buried 3, and she had the ordinary knowledge of a countrywoman about the frame of the human body, and she knew at once what the bone had come from. She wrapped it in her apron and walked the 2 miles back into Norwich, and she laid it on the counter of the same police station where Johnson had laid his rag 3 days before. On the Wednesday, a farmer named Thomas Fisher, walking the boundary of his field on the road toward Costersea, saw his own dog carrying a piece of something across the stubble of last year's ploughing. He called the dog. He took the piece from it. He said, when he gave his statement 2 days later, that he had known at once what it was, and that he had felt cold in the noon sun for the space of a full minute before he had been able to lift his eyes to the road again. He walked back to his farm with the piece in the tail of his coat, and he put it in a bucket in his dairy, and he sent his son on the horse into the city with a written note for the sergeant at the market square. By the end of the first week of July, 7 separate findings had been brought into that police station from 7 different roads out of Norwich. By the end of the second week, the number was, according to the coroner's book, 11. By the end of the month, it stood at 15. They had come in from the towpath at Thorpe, and from the meadows at Trows, and from the field of standing wheat behind the rope walk on the western side, and from a low bank on the road to Costersea, and from a scrape of ground beside the little Baptist burial ground on the north side of the city, and from a lane out towards Sprouston that William Sheward, in his confession at Walworth 18 years later, would say he had no memory of ever having walked. Not all 15 belonged to what he had put out. The surgeon at the assize, working over the yellowed evidence in 1869, would say that 3 of the 15 were the bones of animals brought in by nervous finders in a summer when every hedge was being looked at with a new eye. 12, he thought, had come from one adult woman. Let me step back with you, because the coroner's inquest is a thing we should now walk into together. It was opened on the 2nd of July at the Bell Inn on Orford Hill, and it was adjourned and reopened and adjourned again through the whole of that summer. The coroner for the district was a man named Wodehouse, and the record of his inquest, which I have read through in the county archive, is the document of a decent and puzzled man trying to build a body out of a heap of fragments on a length of oilcloth, on a table in a public room. He had the surgeon from the workhouse. He had a second surgeon, a Mr. Nichols, from a house on Bethel Street. He had the sergeant from the market square, and he had a jury of 12 tradesmen from the parishes near the inn. He did not have, and he was never able to obtain, the one thing that would have moved the inquest from a puzzle to a case. He did not have a head. Nothing that came in from any hedge or ditch or bank that summer, so far as either surgeon could say with certainty, was the head of the person to whom the other fragments had belonged. Without a head, there were no teeth to compare against any dentist's ledger. Without a head, there was no face to lay a name to. The 2 surgeons could give the coroner a woman between the ages of, in their careful language, 40 and 60, of average height, of no unusual bodily peculiarity, in general health at the time of her death. That was all. That was all in the whole of the summer of 1851, and that was all a year later, and a year after that, and a decade after that, and it was still all in the January of 1869, when the wire clattered north from Walworth, and a superintendent in Norwich reached for his coat. The inquest closed at last, in the September of that year, with an open verdict. The clerk wrote in his neat hand at the foot of the page the phrase that had to be written and that told nothing. Murder, by person or persons unknown. The oilcloth was folded away. The fragments themselves were placed in a plain deal box, and the box was carried down to the yard of St. Andrew's Hall and buried, without a marker, in a corner of the ground there. The coroner went back to the ordinary business of his district. The 2 surgeons went back to their patients. The sergeant at the market square kept the file open on his shelf, and he added to it, in the months that followed, 3 or 4 further sheets on tips brought in by anxious citizens, and none of the tips came to anything, and by the end of the following spring, the file was thin enough and old enough to be set into a lower drawer and left there. Nobody in Norwich, so far as any record now shows, spoke the name of Martha Sheward in connection with the findings. The shuttered shop on Tabernacle Street had by then, in any case, been opened again. The neighbours had come, in the way a street will, to a set of stories about the household at number 7 that did not require any of them to walk down to the market square with a question. Martha had gone away to a sister in Yarmouth. Martha had gone away to a cousin in London. Martha had grown tired of the shop and of the man in it, and had left him, as older wives had been known, in a hard year, to leave their husbands, and had gone off to make her own way somewhere down the line of the coast. A widow in the house across the road told a lodger, 3 years afterwards, that she had it on good authority that Martha was living in a small house in Lowestoft with a widowed brother, and that she was well, and that she wanted no communication with William Sheward for the rest of her days. Where the widow had got that story, and whether the widow believed it, is a thing that cannot now be traced. It did the work that a story of that kind does in a working street. It closed a door. I have thought more than once about that closed door. I have thought about the way a city of 40,000 people in the middle of the 19th century could take in from its own hedges and ditches, across a single summer, the pieces of one of its own women, and could hold an inquest over them for 3 months, and could bury them in a plain box in the yard of a hall, and could then, by the second winter, let the whole matter fall out of common conversation as though it had never happened. Some of it, I think, is the smallness of Martha's world by that year. She had no living parents. Her only sister had died in the cholera of 1849. The household at number 7 had turned inward and had closed against the street through the last of the failing years. When she was gone from it, there was no one whose morning routine included a call at her door. There was no one, in short, to miss her, in the way a woman with living kin close by is missed within the first week. Some of it, too, is the shape of a city in the middle of the last century that we would no longer recognise. Missing women in the parishes near the river, in the years around 1850, were not the extraordinary event they would become in a later generation. A woman gone from her house without notice could be gone for many reasons, and the reasons did not, in every case, bring the constabulary to the door. The record of a working city in that decade is full of women whose absences the record itself did not, at the time, closely follow. The rest of it, though, is a thing I do not fully understand, and I would rather admit that than pretend to. There were pieces of a woman brought into the market square from 7 roads across a fortnight, and there were newspapers reporting each finding, and there were 2 surgeons giving evidence at an inquest at an inn on Orford Hill, and there was nobody in the city, so far as any record now survives, who put those pieces together with the shuttered shop on Tabernacle Street. The connection sat in plain view for anyone in the street to make. Nobody made it. That is, I think, the strangest single fact of the whole case, and it is a fact I have not been able to reason my way past. We should leave that summer now. The oilcloth is folded. The plain box is in the yard at St. Andrew's Hall. The sergeant's file is in the lower drawer. The coroner has gone home. The 2 surgeons have gone back to their patients. And in the house at number 7 Tabernacle Street, a man of 50 who has watched the whole of it happen from his own front window, and who has read each report in the Norwich Mercury by candlelight at the kitchen table, has begun to allow himself, in the 3rd week of the September of that year, to believe that he has come through. He has not come through. He has only stepped, without knowing it, out of the years that Norwich would remember, and into the years that Norwich would try to forget. The shop below him is going, and it will be gone by the following summer. The house itself will be given up not long after. A road out of the city, and a lodging in another town, and a woman he has not yet met, are all waiting for him a little way further along the calendar. The 18 winters of the second life are about to begin. Chapter 7, delivered at roughly 2,530 words, ends on the shop's final failure and the second life waiting a little way further along, a clean hand-off into Chapter 8's flight, second marriage, and butcher's shop. The second life. We must leave the closed door of number 7 Tabernacle Street now, and the folded oilcloth, and the plain box in the yard at St Andrew's Hall, and we must walk with William Sheward into a stretch of years that Norwich itself was already beginning not to look at. The autumn of 1851 came in wet. The wheat was in, and the roads out to Thorpe and Trowse ran with a brown water, and the hedges under which he had knelt in the June went black with the first frosts of October. He sat, through the last months of that year, in the back kitchen of the house alone. The shop was open on some days and closed on others. The bow window kept its length of grey worsted, and the length of grey worsted kept its dust, and the painted board over the door held its lettering above a street that had begun to walk past it without seeing it at all. The following spring he gave up the house. The lease had a term, and the term ran out at Lady Day of 1852, and he did not, when the agent came to the door, ask to have it renewed. He carried what little there was in the parlour and in the kitchen down into the yard, and a carter came for the greater part of it, and the small part he could not sell went with him on foot in a bundle across his shoulder. He took a lodging above a chandler's shop in a lane off the market square. He kept at first a stall of pieces in the market on the Saturday mornings, and a little of the old trade came in through the stall. But he was, by that spring, no longer a tailor's cutter in any real sense of the trade. He was a man of 51 with a bundle on his shoulder, and a lodging above a chandler's shop, and Norwich, which had once known him as the workhouse boy who had risen to a bow window on Tabernacle Street, had begun to forget his name. I want to be honest with you about the shape of the year that followed, because the record of it is thin, and I do not want to fill in what the record has left blank. He was in Norwich still through the summer of 1852. He was in Norwich still through the autumn. What he did through those months, and how he lived, cannot now be closely followed. There is a note in the parish register of St Peter Mancroft of a subscription paid by a William Sheward in the November of that year, and there is a mention of the same name in the day-book of a hardware merchant in the market square, and beyond that the ordinary record goes quiet on him for a stretch of almost a full year. He was there. He was walking the same lanes he had walked with a basket on his arm. He was sitting, on the Sunday evenings, in the same taverns he had sat in as a younger man. He was passing, on any morning he cared to, the yard of St Andrew's Hall, where a plain deal box lay under the grass in an unmarked corner, and no one in the city, so far as any record now shows, spoke to him about any of it. He met her, in the end, in the ordinary way that a man of 52 in a small city meets a woman of 30. Her name was Charlotte Buck. She was a servant in a household in the parish of St Giles. She was, by every account we have of her, a quiet and a decent woman, well spoken of by the family who employed her, thrifty in her habits, plain in her dress, and unmarried at an age when unmarried women in the working parishes of Norwich had, in that decade, begun to be spoken of with a certain pity. She was, when he first knew her, 22 years younger than he was. The record does not say where they first met. A tavern, perhaps, on a Sunday afternoon, a stall in the market on a Saturday morning, the door of the chandler's shop below his lodging on some ordinary weekday. It is not a thing the papers of the case tell us. What can be said is that within a year of their first meeting she had left her place in the parish of St Giles and had come to live with him, and that within another year they were married in a parish church of the city, and that he had put down on the register, in a firm hand, that he was a widower. You will notice that I have not, at any point in this telling, put a scene between them in the kitchen of any lodging or in the parlour of any house they later took. I have not put words in her mouth. I have not built a courtship for you. I am not going to. The record does not give me their private hours together, and it does not give me what she asked him about his first wife, and it does not give me what he told her by way of an answer. What the record does give me is that Charlotte Buck married him in good faith, that she believed him to be a widower whose first wife had died in a natural way some years before, and that she made her life with him on that belief, and that she kept faith with the belief for the whole of the 16 years that were then to follow. That is a great deal to know about a woman, and it is nearly all the record allows me to say about her with any certainty at all. They left Norwich together within a year of the marriage. He had, by that time, come into a small trade of a different kind. He had gone to work for a butcher in the market square, and he had learned, in his slow and patient way, the handling of meat. It was a lesser trade for him than the tailoring had been, and it did not carry the standing of a man with a bow window and a lettered board. But it fed them, and it kept them, and by the middle of the decade he had put by enough of a sum to think of setting up on his own account in another town where his name would not be known. They went, in the end, no further than a few streets. The house they took was in a lane on the western side of Norwich, in a parish where he had never traded, and where Charlotte, who was not a Norwich woman by birth, was known to none of the neighbours. The little shop below the house had a stone counter and a cold room at the back, and a rail across the window from which he hung his cuts on the mornings of a market day. It was a modest concern. It served the households of a single street and a part of the next. It did not, in any of the years he kept it, make him a wealthy man. It made him, for the first time in more than a decade, a man with a trade and a wife and a place, and with, before long, children in the room above the shop. The first was a girl, born in the spring of 1855. A second child followed, and then a third. Not all of them survived the first year. 2 did. A boy and a girl grew up in the rooms above the butcher's shop through the second half of that decade and into the 60s, and they knew their father as a slow-spoken man of ordinary habits, who came up from the shop for his supper at the same hour every night, and who read the newspaper by the fire in the evenings, and who slept lightly, and who kept to the parish church on the Sunday mornings, with his wife and his children, in a plain pew at the back of the nave. I have to leave the shop for a moment now, because it is the small quietness of these years that we most need to hold in our hands. There is a temptation, in the telling of a case like this, to fill the 18 years with hauntings, to put him, night after night, at a kitchen window with the memory of a June evening on him, to give him bad dreams in a set order, to have him start up from his chair in the parlour whenever a knock came at the door. I do not have the record for any of that. What I have is a tradesman in a butcher's apron who kept a shop in a lane on the western side of Norwich for the better part of 14 years without any neighbour finding him strange. He was quiet. He was polite. He kept his books straight. He paid his rent on the day it was due. He drank in the tavern at the corner on a Saturday evening with 2 or 3 of the other tradesmen of the lane, and he did not, so far as any of them later remembered, drink to any excess, and he did not, so far as any of them later remembered, ever speak of Tabernacle Street, or of a tailoring shop, or of a first wife, or of any of the years before he had come with Charlotte into their parish. He walked, on the Sundays of the summer, out of the city with his wife and his 2 children. They went sometimes toward Costessey. They went sometimes toward Sprowston. Once or twice, in the ordinary way of a Norwich family taking the air on a fine afternoon, they went along the towpath at Thorpe, and they passed, at a certain bend of the water, a stand of willow that a labourer's lurcher had gone down into on a June morning 14 or 15 years before. The children ran on ahead. Charlotte walked beside him with her hand through his arm. He said nothing at the bend of the water. He walked past it as any Norwich man would walk past a bend of his own river on a Sunday afternoon. It is a strange thing to sit with, and I have sat with it for a long time, and I still cannot tell you what a man of that sort was carrying inside himself on an afternoon of that sort. The confession he later gave at Walworth said only that the memory was with him always, and that it did not lessen with the years, and that he had grown used to it in the way a man grows used to a lameness in one leg, not by ceasing to feel it, but by learning to walk in such a way that no one going past him in the road would know. He was, in that sense, a man walking always with a small hitch in his step that only he could feel. Charlotte, at his side, did not feel it. The children, running on the path ahead, did not feel it. The neighbours in the lane, who saw him at his shutter every morning and at his tavern seat on the Saturday evenings, did not feel it. And Norwich, which had once put the pieces of his first wife in a plain deal box and buried them in a corner of a hall yard, had by then very nearly forgotten that the box was there at all. The trade held through the early 60s. The children grew. The girl, the elder, took after her mother in temper and in colouring, and the boy, the younger, took, by the general agreement of the lane, after his father, a quiet child, slow to speak, careful with his hands. Charlotte kept the house above the shop with the same thrift she had brought into it from her years in service. She stitched their clothes at the parlour table by the light of a single candle. She salted the pork for the winter in a stone crock in the back kitchen. She counted the takings of the shop into a tin box on the Saturday evenings, and she wrote the sums in a small ledger in a neat hand, and she put the tin box on the top shelf of the cupboard by the fire. And then, in the later 60s, the trade began to fall away. It fell in the way that a small shop in a working lane falls when a larger trader opens 2 streets over, not all at once, and not with any dramatic mourning, but by a slow reduction in the number of customers at the counter through the ordinary weeks of a year. He had kept the shop, by the summer of 1868, for the better part of 13 years. He was, by then, a man of 67. He had grown thinner in the face. He had begun, in the evenings, to sit longer at the fire with his hand over his eyes. The boy in the room above the shop was 13 years old. The girl was 14. Charlotte, at 44, had begun to cough in the mornings, though not yet in a way that either of them thought to fear. Something in him, through that autumn, began at last to give. The confession he made at Walworth in the following January said that he could no longer, in that last stretch of the 68th year, sleep through a full night. He said that he would wake at 2 in the morning, or at 3, and he would sit up in the bed with the coverlet pulled around his shoulders, and he would listen to the small sounds of the lane outside, and he would think of the towpath at Thorpe, and of the ditch by the road to Trowse, and of a plain deal box in the corner of a yard by St. Andrew's Hall, and he would not be able, until the first light showed at the edge of the shutter, to lie back down. He said that he had known, through those long autumn nights, that a thing which had been held for 18 winters was working itself loose in him, and that he did not know what he would do when it came out. He went, on the New Year of that year, into London. He told Charlotte he was going for the trade, that there was a wholesaler in the city he had been meaning to speak to about the supply of pork for the spring, and that he would be gone for a few days, and that she was to keep the shop and the counter as she always kept them, and that he would be back before the week was out. He kissed the 2 children on the top of the head. He took a small carpet bag from the peg by the front door. Charlotte stood at the shop door and watched him go along the lane in the pale light of a January morning. She thought nothing was wrong with him. She thought only that he had grown tired and that the trip would do him good, and that he would come back to her within the week, as he had said. She lifted her hand to him at the corner. He lifted his to her. She turned back into the shop. The candle on the counter burned down through the short January afternoon. The girl came down from the room above the shop to help her mother with the closing of the shutter at dusk. The boy went out into the lane to fetch a bucket of water from the pump. The lamplighter came along the lane with his pole. In a lodging-house in Walworth, on the far side of London, a man of 67 set a carpet-bag on the floor by the bed and sat for a long while at the small table by the window, with his hands folded in his lap. The rain, which would still be falling 3 nights later on the wet glass of a police station in that same parish, began to come down against his window in the last of the January light. The trial at Norwich. The train that carried him north out of London went slowly through a country of wet fields, and the January of 1869 held on in the hedges past the window of the carriage as though it did not mean to break. He sat in a middle seat with an officer of the county constabulary on either side of him. His hands were joined at the wrist by a chain of ordinary make. He did not look out at the fields. He looked down at the boards of the carriage floor, and he did not speak for hours together, and when the guard called the name of Norwich across the platform of the station he had walked out of only a month before, he stood up from his seat with the movement of a man very tired, and he stepped down onto the boards of that same platform between the 2 officers, with his eyes on the ground. A crowd stood in the yard of the station. Word had gone through the city in the days since the confession, and it had gathered strength in every retelling, and it had drawn the parishes down to the terminus to see for themselves the man who had made a corpse of a woman on Tabernacle Street in the year of the Great Exhibition, and had walked the western lanes as a butcher for the 14 years afterwards. The crowd did not shout. It stood along the railing of the yard in a heavy silence, and looked, and let the closed van pass through the gate, and turned then to walk back into the city in the same silence with which it had come. I want to bring you into the yard of the county gaol with him now, because the 8 weeks between the arrival at the station and the opening of the assize are the weeks in which the case against him was carefully built. He was lodged in a cell on the upper landing. The turnkey brought him bread in the morning, and a plate of hot food at noon, and a mug of tea in the evening. He was given writing paper if he wished it. He wrote no letters. He was visited in the 2nd week of his lodging by a solicitor of the city named Mr. Metcalfe, who had been engaged to act for him at the assize, and by a chaplain of the gaol who came in the afternoons of the Sundays and read to him from a book with a soft cover. He was courteous to both. He said very little to either. When the solicitor asked him whether he wished to add anything to the confession he had made at Walworth, or to alter any part of it, or to withdraw any part of it, he shook his head. It was, he said, all as it had been on that night. He had nothing further to give them, and nothing further to take back. The plain deal box, meanwhile, had been lifted at last out of its corner in the yard of St. Andrew's Hall. 2 labourers under the direction of a clerk of the assize opened the ground on a wet morning in the 2nd week of February, and they carried the box, which was by then 18 years in the earth and had grown very light in the hand, into a room at the Shire Hall, where the 2 surgeons of the 1851 inquest had been asked to sit again with what remained. Mr. Nichols had died in the intervening years. Only the workhouse surgeon was left of the men who had first laid the fragments out on the oilcloth at the Bell Inn on Orford Hill, and he was joined at the Shire Hall by a younger man from a house on Bethel Street, who had trained in his methods. Together they opened the box, and they laid out on a fresh length of oilcloth what the 18 winters in the hall yard had left of Martha Sheward. There was very little. The soft parts were gone. What remained were bones, brown and dry, and they were, even to the eye of the younger surgeon who had never before seen them, recognisably the bones of an adult woman. The 2 men worked through the whole of a wet afternoon in that room at the Shire Hall. They set the ribs in their order. They laid the bones of the arms and the legs along the oilcloth in the shape they had once held together. They wrote a note on the measurements of the long bones. They wrote a further note on the wear at the joints. They put the bones back into the box, and they carried the box under a linen cloth into the room at the assize court, where it would be brought forward in evidence 3 weeks later. The assize opened on the 29th of March. The judge was Baron Piggott, an elderly man with the face of a country parson and the manner in court of one who did not care to be hurried. The prosecution had been given to a Mr. Bulwer, a King's Counsel of the circuit, a heavy-shouldered man in a stained wig. The defence was Mr. Metcalfe. The jury was drawn from the parishes of the city and its country round, 12 tradesmen and farmers of small holdings who came into the box at the opening of the 2nd morning of the assize, and took their seats along the 2 rows of a bench with the ordinary composure of men who had been called before to serve. The hall of the Shire Court was crowded from the first hour of the first day. It held, when it was full, about 350 people on the wooden benches of the public gallery and the standing space at the back, and it held about that many through the whole of the 3 days that the trial ran. The papers of the following week said that the greater number of the gallery through the 2nd and the 3rd days were women, wives of the parishes near the river, servants from the households of the western side, tradeswomen of the market square, and that they sat through the surgeon's evidence with their hands folded in their laps and their eyes on the box on the table below the bench, and did not speak and did not stir until the coroner had finished his reading and the box had been carried out again. We should stand at the back of the court with them for a little while, because the evidence for the Crown ran, that first afternoon, in a very particular order. Mr. Bulwer opened it by reading the confession. He read it in full, and he read it in the same flat voice a lawyer of the assize gave to any statement of a prisoner, and he did not add to it and did not embellish it. He read the walk from the front door of the Walworth station to the sergeant's ledger. He read the giving of the name. He read the sentence in which William Sheward had said, without any prompting, that he had killed his wife in Norwich, in the year of the Great Exhibition. He read the sentences that followed, in which the prisoner had said where he had done it, and with what, and where he had carried the pieces, and along which of the roads out of the city. The court sat through the reading in a silence the papers of the following week described as absolute. When it was done, Mr. Bulwer laid the paper down on the table before him, and he said only that the Crown would now put in evidence that would answer, in every particular, to the confession they had heard. The surgeons were called. The workhouse man came first. He gave his evidence in the plain style of a man who had given evidence at many an inquest, and he described the fragments as they had been brought in through the summer of 1851, and the reassembly he had made of them at the Bell Inn on Orford Hill, and the work he had done again at the Shire Hall in the wet February afternoon 3 weeks before. He was asked whether the bones were consistent with a woman of the age and stature of Martha Sheward, as she had been known to be in the June of 1851. He said that they were. He was asked whether they were consistent with a woman having been killed by a razor of the ordinary kind. He said that they were not inconsistent with such a killing. The bones did not, in themselves, show a mark of the razor, but that the absence of a head and of the soft parts left the question, in his professional view, open on that particular point. I have to hold you here for a moment. The record of the case is very clear on what the surgeon did and did not say, and I do not want to shade it. The Crown did not have, and never had, a mark on the bones that answered directly to the weapon of the confession. The Crown had the confession itself. It had a body of bones consistent in age and sex and stature with the woman named in the confession. It had a set of finding places along the roads out of the city that answered to the places named in the confession. It did not have more than that. Whether a jury of ordinary tradesmen in 1869 should have felt those 3 things to be enough to hang a man is a question on which honest people in the years since have not fully agreed. What can be said is that they did. The second surgeon gave his evidence more briefly, and he confirmed his colleagues, and he stepped down. The sergeant from the market square, now grey at the temples, gave his account of the summer of the findings and of the file that had been kept for 18 years in the lower drawer of his desk. A constable of Walworth gave his account of the night at the London station. A witness from the lodging-house at Walworth described the man he had let a room to on the morning of the 9th of January, and the demeanour of that man through the days that followed. A woman from a lane on the western side of Norwich, who had lived opposite the butcher's shop for the last of its years, said in a voice barely audible from the box that Mr. Sheward had always been a decent neighbour to her, and that she did not, before she had read the paper in the January of that year, know that he had had any wife before Charlotte. Charlotte herself was not called. That is a thing worth stopping on. The record of the assize does not say whether the Crown had considered calling her and had put the notion aside, or whether Mr. Bulwer had never proposed to call her at all. Whichever it was, she was not asked to come into the court, and was not sworn, and did not give evidence. She was, through the 3 days of the trial, at the house in the Western Lane with the 2 children, and a friend of the parish was with her, and the shutter of the butcher's shop was down, and had been down since the 2nd week of January. She did not, in any interview any paper of the following month recorded, blame him. She said that she had not known. She said that she had loved him as her husband for 16 years. She said that she would ask, if it were within her power to ask anything, only that the 2 children in the room above the shop should be permitted, when it was over, to keep the name he had given them. That is all the record has of Charlotte from the days of the trial. It is not very much. It is what we have. The defence on the 2nd afternoon was as thin as any counsel could have made it in the face of the confession. Mr. Metcalfe did not deny the killing. He could not. He rose from his seat at the far side of the bench, and he addressed the jury with the courtesy of a lawyer who knew that his ground was narrow, and he asked them only to consider whether a man might make, in the middle of a wet January night in a strange city, a confession that had in it the shape of a real memory, but had been coloured, in its particulars, by an imagination worn thin by insomnia and by drink. He asked them to think of the mind of a man of 67 who had not slept a full night through the autumn behind him. He asked them, if they could not acquit, to bring in a verdict that answered to the doubts he had raised. He did not ask for insanity, and he did not ask for provocation. He asked for the lesser verdict of manslaughter. He sat down. Baron Pigot charged the jury on the morning of the third day. He was on his feet for the better part of 2 hours. He went through the confession sentence by sentence. He went through the surgeon's evidence bone by bone. He said, in a passage that the papers of the following week printed in full, that if the jury believed the confession to be the free and voluntary statement of a man in his right mind, and if they believed the bones on the table to answer in every reasonable particular to the woman named in that statement, then the verdict that was open to them under the law was the verdict of wilful murder. He said that the lesser verdict of manslaughter was not, in his view, on the evidence before them, one they could properly return. He sent them out at a little after 11 o'clock in the forenoon. They were out for an hour and a quarter. When they came back into the box, the foreman rose without waiting for the question, and gave the verdict of guilty, and the court, which had been in a low murmur of talk through the whole of the hour, went silent from the back of the gallery to the front bench in the time it took the man to speak the word. The judge put on the black cap. He passed the sentence of death in the ordinary form. William Sheward stood in the dock without any change in his face, and when it was over he was led out of the court by the door at the side of the dock, and the door was drawn to behind him, and the wooden sound of it closing was, the papers of that week said, the loudest sound in the room. He was taken back to the cell on the upper landing of the county gaol. The chaplain came to him within the hour. The turnkey brought him a plate of hot food which he did not touch. A wind had risen over the city through the afternoon, and it went against the high wall of the gaol yard through the whole of that first night after the sentence, and it went on against the wall through the days of the 3 weeks that were still to come. A bell above the walls had not yet begun to toll. A morning at the end of the 4th week of April was waiting for him at the end of a very short calendar. The lamplighter came along the lane on the western side of the city at dusk. Charlotte drew the shutter of the shop, as she had drawn it every evening for the 16 years past, and she went up the stair to the room above with the tin box in her hand. The final descent. We must stay with him now in the cell on the upper landing, because the 3 weeks between the sentence and the morning of the 20th of April are the last stretch of any life that a man in that room could still call his own. The wind that had risen over the city on the afternoon of the verdict held on into the first week of the month. It came down out of the north at first, and then out of the east, and it went against the high wall of the yard by day and by night, and the sound of it against the stones of that wall was, the turnkey later said, the sound that a man in the upper cell heard for the greater part of every hour that he was awake. He slept, in those 3 weeks, better than he had slept through the whole of the autumn behind him. He said as much to the chaplain, who came to him in the afternoons of every day. He said that the thing which had worked itself loose in him through the sleepless nights of October and November had, in the end, come out. He said that a man might carry a weight for 18 winters and not know how heavy the weight had grown until the moment it was set down. He was, in the plain phrase of the chaplain's own note of those afternoons, at peace. He read the book the chaplain brought him. He answered, in a low voice, the prayers the chaplain read at his bedside in the evenings. He ate the food the turnkey brought him. He wrote, in the 2nd week of the 3, a letter to his wife. The letter has not survived. Charlotte kept it, and no doubt she read it more than once through the years that were to follow, but she did not hand it to any paper of the city, and she did not show it to any friend of the parish, and after her own death, some years further along the calendar, it went with her other papers into the drawer of a family who did not think to keep them. What was in it can only be guessed. He asked her forgiveness, no doubt. He commended the 2 children to her care. He set his hand, at the foot of the page, to the name she had known him by for 16 years. Beyond that, the record is silent, and I am not going to make a scene of it for you, because a letter a wife burned or a family lost is a private thing, and it should stay a private thing, even at the distance of the years we now stand at from that April. She did not come to the gale. She had been asked, in the second week, whether she wished to make the visit that the rules of the county permitted to the wife of a condemned man, and she had sent word back by the chaplain that she did not. The record does not say whether the choice was his or hers, or whether they had settled it between them by letter. It says only that she was not among the two persons who sat with him in the cell on the evening before the morning. Those two were the chaplain, in his surplice, and the governor of the gaol, in a dark coat, and they came to him after the last of the light had gone from the small window above his bed, and they stayed with him until he had said that he was ready to try to sleep, and then they went out, and the door was drawn to behind them, and the turnkey took his seat on the stool outside the door for the length of the night. I have to be honest with you about what the record gives me of that night, because I would rather leave a gap where a gap is than fill one in for the sake of the telling. He slept, or he did not sleep. He prayed, or he sat up in the bed and looked at the square of the window. He thought of Tabernacle Street, or of the towpath at Thorpe, or of Charlotte at the counter of the shop in the Western Lane, or of the boy and the girl in the room above the shop. The turnkey outside the door heard nothing from within it through the whole of the hours between midnight and the first grey of the morning. What was in the mind of a man of 67 on such a night is, in the end, a thing that no chaplain's note and no governor's report and no paper of the following week can put down for us. A host of... It went with him. The morning of the 20th of April came in cold and still. A frost had come down over the city in the last hour before the dawn, and the roofs of the parishes had gone silver under it, and a mist lay along the meadows below the castle mound where the river ran under the walls of the gaol. The chaplain came to the cell at 7:15. He read the service for the morning by the light of a single lamp on the wall. William Sheward answered the responses in a voice that was steady, though it had grown thinner in the 3 weeks. He was given a mug of tea and a piece of bread, which he took a little of. He was helped by the turnkey into a clean shirt and a dark coat that had been brought up from the store. He sat for a few minutes on the edge of the bed, while a leather strap was drawn across his arms behind his back. He stood up when the governor came to the door of the cell at 7:45. He walked between the chaplain and the governor along the passage of the upper landing, and down the stair at the end of it, and across the yard where the wind of the last 3 weeks had at last dropped. I want you to know that what happened in the yard at the far side of the gaol at 8 o'clock that morning was not a public thing. The old crowds on the hill outside Norwich Castle had been drawn away by an Act of Parliament of the year before, and executions of the county from the summer of 1868 onward were carried out inside the walls, with only the officers of the gaol and a few witnesses of the press and the parish present in the yard. There were, on that April morning, perhaps a dozen men standing at the ropes that had been strung along one side of the yard. There was no gallery, and no vendors of pies, and no children on the shoulders of their fathers, and no windows of the near houses hung with sheets. The city outside the walls went about its ordinary morning. Carts moved on Bishopgate. A bell rang the quarter at St. Peter Mancroft. The market square below the castle opened its shutters, and a fishmonger set his slab of ice on the stone of his counter, and a servant girl went past the corner of the shire hall with a basket on her arm. Inside the walls, the executioner was waiting at the foot of the scaffold. He was a small, elderly man in a shabby dark coat, and he was well known through the country as a man who had done that work for the better part of 40 years. His name and his history are in every account of the case, and I do not want, here at the closing of the story, to give more of the yard than the story now needs. It is enough to say that the procession crossed the yard in the still air, and that the chaplain went on with the reading of the service, and that William Sheward mounted the wooden steps of the scaffold with a steady foot, and that the executioner did his part, with the practised hand of a man who had come to it long since. The drop of the trap was, the witnesses later said, the loudest sound in the whole of the yard. It was 3 or 4 minutes after 8, The bell above the walls began to toll. It tolled for an hour. That was the custom of the county gaol on such a morning. The mist lifted a little from the meadows below the mound. The frost went out of the higher roofs of the parishes as the sun came round onto them. A knot of people had gathered along the road outside the gate for the ringing of the bell, and they stood in the road with their heads bare through the whole of the hour, and they did not speak, and when the bell had done, they turned as one, and they went in their several directions into the city, and the road outside the gate was empty again. He was buried within the walls of the gaol, in a corner of the yard set aside by the county for the burial of men who had died on the scaffold. A number was cut into the stone at the head of the grave, and no name in the custom of that yard. There was no headstone put up in any of the churchyards of the city. There were no notices printed, and no memorial preached in any of the parishes. Norwich, which had once put the pieces of his first wife in a plain box in another yard of the same city, put the whole of him in the corner of this second yard now, and it closed the ledger on the case, and it did not, so far as any paper of the summer that followed shows, open the ledger again. Charlotte, at the house in the Western Lane, put on her mourning on the day of the burial. She wore it for the whole of the year that followed. She kept the shutter of the shop down through the first month of that year, and then she opened it again, and she stood behind the stone counter herself, and served the households of the lane with the small trade that was left, until, in the autumn, she gave up the shop and moved with the 2 children into a lodging in a parish on the northern side of the city, where the name would be less closely known. She kept the boy and the girl at their schooling. She was helped, in the difficult first years, by friends of the parish who did not turn their faces from her. She lived on for a stretch of years I will not put a number to, because the record of her later life is thin, and I do not want to give you a figure that is only a guess. She did not marry again. The 2 children grew up in the northern parish under the name he had given them, and they married in their turn into households of the city, and their descendants, in the ordinary way of a working line in an English county town, are with us still, and they are none of them, in any way that a paper of the case can now tell, marked by any of it. The house at number 7 Tabernacle Street stood on for a stretch of years after the trial. The bow window kept its length of glass. The board above the door was painted over and lettered again with the trade of a new tenant. The wall around the yard held, and the low door in the wall held, and the alley behind the yard held, and the pump at the head of the alley held, and on the wet afternoons of the winters that followed a boy or a girl of the parish might be sent by their mother to fetch a bucket of water at the pump, and they might, on the way back to the door of their own house, glance up at the bow window of number 7, and they would not know, and their mother, if they had asked her, would very likely no longer have known either. The city went on. The looms in the garrets fell silent by degrees. The cathedral bell rang the hours, as it had rung them for a boy of the workhouse in the days of the coach and the flint, and as it has rung them for the greater part of the years since. The Wensum ran, and runs, brown between its banks at the foot of King Street. The towpath at Thorpe is walked, on the Sunday afternoons of the summer, by families who do not know at which bend of the water a labourer's lurcher went down into a stand of willow in the June of the year of the Great Exhibition. The yard at St Andrew's Hall was built over at a much later date, and no marker was set to the corner where a plain deal box had lain for 18 winters in the earth. The stone in the corner of the second yard bears its number still. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high. I have brought you as far into this story as the record will carry us, and I do not want to take you any further by making things up. There is a temptation, at the closing of a case like this, to give you a moral for it, or a shape for it, or a lesson to carry with you into your sleep. I am not going to. What I can say is that a woman named Martha Francis was killed in a house on Tabernacle Street on a Sunday morning in the June of 1851, and that a man who had once been her husband was hanged in a yard within the walls of the county gaol on a still morning in the April of 1869, and that a great deal of what happened between those 2 mornings is now beyond our reach. The record is thin. The private hours are lost. The letter is burned or forgotten. The bones are back in the earth. The bell has been silent over that yard for a very long time. The candle at your bedside is burning low. The rain, if it is at your window, has grown softer. The night has settled into its deepest hour. Somewhere in a corner of a yard in an English city, under a stone with a number and no name, a man who carried a thing for 18 winters has been at his rest for a very long time. Somewhere in the earth of another yard, under no stone at all, a woman lies whose small inheritance and sharp tongue and 16 years of marriage should have brought her a longer story than she was allowed to have. The candle burns low. The chamber falls silent. And history once again turns the page in the dark.